It's time to get your music radio ready with the Audio Skills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Scott here with you for this week's edition of the Audio Skills Podcast. We have got an excellent show for you today, where we're going to be talking all about recording and mixing guitars, both acoustic and electric. Joining me to explore this subject will be another audio guru who has been really influential to me personally. Joe Gilder, the owner of the site homestudiocorner.com, will be sharing some of his tips and techniques with us. However, before we get to all that, I want to begin with our audio tip of the week. In our courses on audioskills.com, in the articles I write, and even in our members-only Facebook group, I'm a huge fan of giving folks actionable tips and advice to help them get better with their recordings and mixes. The podcast is no different. So with that said, given our theme, my tip this week might come off as a little parental, but I think it's important to mention. Now, I know a lot of folks out there, especially those who might dabble in electric guitar, like things to be loud. Heck, I like things loud. Sometimes when I'm listening to music in my car, I just have to turn the stereo up and really bump it. I did this the other day. I was listening to Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel, and I love the end of that song, and so I was turning it up and really bumping it. Well, my tip is this. Take care of your ears. You only get the one set, and they are pretty much the most important thing when it comes to audio. In general, you shouldn't be mixing too loud, but beyond that, you should be avoiding hearing damage and really treating your ears like an asset. No matter, if you are trying to take on clients and mix professionally, or if you're just making your own music and mixing it, your ears are so important. So, to avoid hearing damage, some points. Number one, when you go to concerts, bring some earplugs. This is something that I hadn't been doing, but at 30, I think it's high time I did it. I'm going to Lollapalooza this year in Chicago. I'm going to bring some earplugs. Even if I don't use them for every set, I'm going to use them because I got to protect these babies, right? Number two, if you listen to headphones, you put your headphones on, especially earbuds, keep your volume at a reasonable level. I know that especially when you're listening to a song that's really awesome, maybe it's something you recorded. I know there's that temptation, but really try to keep the levels under control and not listen too loud. Number three, if you're operating heavy machinery, mowing the lawn, whatever, use some earplugs. Number four, give your ears a rest if you've been mixing for a while. You don't want to strain them. And I mean, it's a good tip just for giving yourself a break to really kind of reset things when you're mixing. But, don't have these like marathon sessions where you're just listening and listening and listening. That's the kind of thing that adds up over time. Number five, if you go to shooting ranges, watch fireworks, or do anything like that, again, use earplugs. Earplugs are crucial. So your hearing is your best asset. And if you want to keep recording and mixing music as you get older, there is no better thing to do than to protect them. All right, I think that's enough of a PSA. That was your audio tip of the week. All right, now moving on to our guest this week, who's going to be helping us explore recording and mixing guitars. I am so stoked to introduce Joe Gilder. Joe is a musician, songwriter, recording and mixing pro based out of Nashville. He has written a ton about recording and mixing on his excellent site, homestudiocorner.com. He also has a fantastic YouTube channel where he shares advice and techniques for mixing and recording, and a podcast, #AskJoeGilder, where he responds to common audio questions and things. And he even runs a community site called Dueling Mixes with Graham Cochran of the Recording Revolution, where they mix songs each month and compare them and have them voted on and basically help the community improve their skills. So needless to say, Joe has a lot of great advice to offer. Joe, thanks so much for joining me today and welcome.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Right on. How are things in Nashville this time of year?
Things are good. If you hear the occasional sawing sound in the background, don't be alarmed. There's a little bit of construction happening here, but things are good here. I actually just got back from a couple weeks vacation, and so yeah, you're one of the first things on the list to knock out when I got back. So feels good.
Right on. Yeah, I actually have a vacation coming up next week. I'm going to be going to Europe for the first time. Yeah, it's a summer, so it's vacation time.
Love it.
Right on. So in this show, I really want to talk about recording and mixing guitars. But to start us off, can you just tell us a little bit more about your experience with recording and mixing, and maybe just a little bit about the projects that you're working on? I mean, you have, at the top, I just mentioned all the things you're involved with. So just a little bit more about all that.
Sure. I think first I'm a musician, and then everything else kind of comes out of that. Mm-hmm. This year, for example, the kind of big thing for this year is set a goal to release 4 EPs this year. And I've released 2 of them. Awesome. So every 3 months I'm releasing one. So I did a full band one that came out March 1st, and then acoustic one that came out June 1st. So I'll do another full band one for September. And so that's been really fun and challenging. Partially just wanting to just create more music myself and give myself an excuse to make a bunch of music this year. But also, since I'm documenting the process on my YouTube channel and places like that, just hope in hopes of inspiring just even a few people who struggle to ever actually do what they want to do or finish a project, to show them,
for sure,
if this idiot can do it, then certainly can do it too.
Right on. So that's been your big focus, and that's really awesome. And it's cool to, that you're sharing that experience with people so they can kind of see, yeah, here's how it goes. And, I can do it if this guy can, for sure.
Yeah. I'm not big on making everything look polished. So when I jack things up, or, I ruined the snare drum recording in the first EP, and I talked all about it, because it's just real life. That's what happens. You get caught up in 18,000 different things going on a session day, and something's going to fall through the cracks. And I think people get the impression that if it happens to them, they're an abysmal failure. And reality is it happens to everybody.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think in anything, and certainly in recording and mixing, I mean, you learn so much more from your mistakes than the times when you did it just right and it came out perfectly. You learn so much more when, like, oh, here's a time I didn't do that the right way and the result was poor.
Yeah. I mean, that's completely it. I think there's this weird idea that you either have to do it perfectly or not at all. And that's just no way to live.
For sure. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about guitars, and I'm thinking either acoustic or electric, because obviously you have to treat those differently. So, my first big question here is, what's one piece of advice you could give someone who wants to record an electric guitar the best way?
It's a good question. I think for a lot of people, and for some people, this is a complete no-brainer and it seems super obvious. But I think especially for the younger crowd who have grown up watching tutorials and learning about software and plugins and seeing all that you can do with technology, it's easy to forget that the guitar tone has to sound good just in the room, right? Guitar plugged into an amp, whatever you're using, that actually has to sound great. And if it doesn't, you need to put the microphone away and stop and get that sounding good before you worry about which mic to use, mic placement, all that stuff. I think it's super stupid obvious, but it's easy to overlook. A lot of people just crank up the amp and slap a mic in front of it and go. And They don't stop to think, well, hey, does this even sound good? Or they may not even know what good sounds like, because they've not put in the work of listening and really understanding what, guitar players in their genre, what kind of tones they're using, and then trying to kind of make sure they're somewhere in the ballpark of that.
Right on. No, that makes a lot of sense. Consider your room. And I think that can apply to a lot of things in recording for sure, but it makes a ton of sense, especially if you got your amp there and everything like that, because you're going to get some of that, no matter how you're miking it, however close you're getting, some of the room is going to get picked up, and that matters.
Yeah. And the other big thing is when you record, because most people that I talk to at least are in the home recording world, most likely the amp is right next to them in the same room they're recording. which is fine. There's no problem with that. But the only problem that comes up when you do that is you may have dialed in a really great sounding tone, but now that you've placed the mic and you start recording, it's so easy to just say, man, this sounds huge and big, and to just blow through a bunch of takes on a bunch of songs and then come back the next day and fire up the session and realize that the recordings don't sound that good at all. Because in the moment you had this massive amp blaring at you, you were hearing that in addition to what you were hearing in your headphones through the mic. And those together sounded massive. The mic by itself didn't. And so many people will approach me and they'll have something like that happen, and they want to know how to use EQ to fix it. And there are things you can do to help, but if you're waiting for some sort of cool EQ trick to fix your bad recording, you're going to wait a really long time.
Yeah.
But what you need to do is stop, record something right at the beginning of the session, then stop, put the guitar down, and listen back to what you recorded. That's what's actually going down. When the guitar is not blaring, listen to what's coming out of the speakers, and then make your decisions from there. Otherwise, you're just flying blind, and you might, spend a day, work really, really hard, and end up with a jacked up recording.
For sure. So connected to that, we have acoustic guitars, and maybe it's the same kind of advice, but what advice or maybe a specific technique suggestion would you have for someone who, they're working with an acoustic guitar and they want to get great sound out of that in their recording?
Yeah, the beginning part is the same for me with anything. The thing has to sound good on its own. So if it's a bad sounding guitar, if it's not in tune, which I'm probably a guitar snob on some level. I'm amazed at some of the recordings I hear that have gone all the way through recording, mixing, and they get to me to listen or a master or something, and the guitar's out of tune. And I'm just kind of baffled how it got that far. And I understand there's just different people may not be able to hear it as well. I mean, things like that, the guitar itself has to sound good. And then for a lot of people, they think you've got to throw 2 microphones on it and get a nice stereo recording. And stereo's great. I did a lot of that on my latest EP, but you can get really good recordings with just a single microphone, but it takes work to figure out where that particular guitar sounds best with the mic. Sometimes putting the mic really close sounds great. Sometimes that sounds like garbage. Sometimes putting it right on the 12th fret is the perfect spot, but then occasionally, I've got 2 acoustics, a Taylor and a Gibson, and they take a completely different mic technique depending on the guitar. The technique I use on one sounds awful on the other, and vice versa. So it takes a lot of that just trial and error of getting to know where to put the mic. And there's no such thing as, you see these engineers and they seem to just know exactly where to put things. Usually, even to if they've been doing this for 30 years, they still probably set up a mic, go listen, see what it sounds like, and then adjust. That's just the normal process. You just set something up and see what it sounds like.
Right. Yeah. Like they might have an idea like, oh, I've worked with this guitar before. I kind of have an idea of where it might be, but even on that given day or whatever it is, it may not be the exact perfect place. So you have to listen and adjust. And that's so key. I mean, I think some people think that there is like, well, there's this silver bullet position technique that I use that will work. And it's like, it's not really what it is.
Yeah, if anything, you have your go-to starting point.
Yes.
And sometimes I'll set it up and I listen back and that sounds great. Let's go. But you have to be willing to say, you know what, that could sound better. Let's spend another 10 minutes trying a few other positions. It's not this huge investment. And I think especially if we have clients who are there that we feel rushed, even though they could care less how long it takes really. We feel like we just have to start. We have to hit record as soon as possible. And we sometimes sacrifice the actual quality of the recording, which is silly because that's the whole reason they're there to begin with. So it makes sense to take a little more time to make sure you've got it in the right spot.
For sure. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, let's assume that it was recorded well or reasonably well. If you could give one mixing tip for mixing electric guitars to help someone get better results, and again, assuming that it was recorded well, what would that be?
All my answers are going to sound like some old grumpy curmudgeon because I kind of come back to the basics a lot. For me, level is probably the biggest thing. I mean, you're probably going to EQ things, but what I found, and you asked your question in such a way, I like it. You said, assuming it was recorded well, don't gloss over that. That's the biggest factor. When people say, if I release a product and they say, oh man, that sounds great. How did you EQ it? I'm always like, hey, that's the wrong question. you maybe ask what guitar was it or something like that. But how you EQ'd it, if it was recorded well, you may not have to do much at all as far as EQ and things like that. So for me, getting the level right, getting the balance right, and getting the panning, those basic steps before you ever slap a plugin on there make a huge difference. You may find yourself wrestling with EQ for 20 minutes only to find, oh, the guitars just weren't loud enough, or vice versa.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's I think it's so easy to overlook like a basic decision, like a panning decision, and think, well, no, I need to really get in there with this specific plugin and start messing around with things, where it's like, well, maybe you just, could try something that's basic and simple. And if you get that right, it's going to sound good.
Oh yeah. It's super easy to do. And it's also super easy to fall into the trap of listening to everything in solo. So like when you're recording, yeah, absolutely listen to it by itself. Make sure it sounds as good as you can possibly get it to sound. But then when it comes time to mix, you kind of have to pretend the solo button doesn't exist, because no one cares what that guitar sounds like by itself. Only how it sits in context of the whole mix. So if it's a big rock mix, if it's a little thin sounding, that's okay. You probably need it to be thin sounding anyway. So don't spend all your time listening by itself, EQing for 30 minutes only to find you literally don't hear any of those changes you made in the final mix.
For sure. So now, and maybe this might be the exact same thing, if we were talking about acoustic guitar, I mean, I could see a lot of those tips kind of being a carryover, but if someone was trying to get better results, would there be any other mixing advice they would have? Okay, you're working with an acoustic as opposed to an electric.
Yeah. I'd say don't reach for the compressor just by default. I rarely compress acoustic guitar. I'm usually doing some sort of compression on my mix bus to overall bus compression, and that usually is enough. It hits the acoustic enough to give it what it needs. A lot of people reach too quickly for that compressor, kind of that whole, well, I saw someone use a compressor once, so I'm going to do it. And to me, an acoustic guitar is a beautiful instrument, and compression almost always jacks it up on some level, and sometimes that's good. If it's a big rock mix and it's just a big strumming part that's really just a background part, sometimes compression can bring out the pick sound and make it sound a little more appropriate for that style of music. But if it's anything where you're really hearing the acoustic guitar fairly
where it's
clearly,
the star of the show, as it were.
Yeah, then to me, too much compression will just ruin that. Spending some time with EQ, the low mids are where you're going to spend your time too. Even if it's recorded well, there's probably something around 150, 200 hertz that's going to be a little bit too warm, a little too muddy. So a couple of subtle moves down there. But if you find yourself doing anything extreme, chances are something went wrong elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. So I love this question. I ask a lot of people this. What is the biggest mistake either you have made or you have seen made when it comes to mixing guitars?
That's a good question. Biggest mistake when it comes to mixing guitars. For me, it comes down to trying to fix bad recordings in the mix. Because I think about an album I released. This was 8 years ago, and I was living in an little apartment, and I was just trying to get the mics as close to the guitar as possible so I wouldn't hear the girl dancing in the apartment upstairs. And I used 2 microphones because I was thinking stereo's got to be better, and I slapped those mics just as close as I could. And with the headphones, I had, decent little headphones, but it sounded huge, it sounded great. And I took about, 5 minutes to set it up, get levels, and then I recorded, I think, like 10 songs that day. I just blew through them all.
Wow.
And then I came in the next day or a week later and started listening back, and every one of those recordings was super boomy. And in hindsight, it would have been worth it to take another day to record it well. But I was just stubborn and said, I'm not going to let that whole day go to waste. I'm going to mix these. And it was really a nightmare of mixing. It just took so many attempts at some crazy looking EQs to get it to sound at best mediocre. And for me, I don't think mixing should be about trying to rescue something bad. I think most of the time it should be about enhancing something that was already done really well. And I'm glad I did it because, occasionally you do, if you're like mixing for clients or whatever, you sometimes get a jacked up recording that you just have to make the best of. So it's good to have practice in doing that. But I think it was, for me, over the years of getting better and better and realizing, man, when I put in the work, and it's work, like it's frustrating to do it over and over until you get it right. but man, it makes the whole rest of the process so much easier. So for me, I guess my biggest mixing mistake is trying to pretend that I can be like the superhero who can fix any recording. It's just not that fun, and it never turns out that great.
Yeah. Now it's interesting though, kind of when you mention that, because I know, and I've had this myself, where there's like a fine line between get it right and I want to finish and finish the project and get the recording down to like, I could try 50 different microphone positions and be like, is this one good? Is this one good? How do you draw that line where it's like, this is good enough, this is going to work, this sounds good to me, versus like, okay, well, this whole day is lost because, I'm just sitting here messing around with this one part because it's just not right in the recording phase.
Yeah. I mean, it almost seems like I'm pulling from both directions and not being consistent, right? Because there's an element of don't aim for perfection. And then there's this other side saying, get it right.
Yeah.
It's like, Dad, I'm trying. So I think it's like most things in life, there's a balance. What I think people try to do is they want to, mixing is just, it's kind of the sexy thing, right? It's the thing that everyone wants to, I've been releasing videos for 8 years now, and it's always the mixing related ones that are a little more popular, get more views, get more comments. And even though I find recording and production far more interesting myself, it's the thing, it's the shiny, bright object that people want to learn about because it is fun. I love mixing. It's a super fun thing. But for me, there's just it's not as musical as sitting down with musicians and getting something that sounds great right off, as soon as you record it. So for me, I think I preach a lot, just shift the focus a little bit. Like you're not going to be perfect in anything you're doing, but if you're blowing through recording time just to spend hours and hours and hours on mixing time and you end up super frustrated, because a lot of people think I must be a horrible mix engineer. And I kind of am trying to say, no, good news. You're a horrible recording engineer, but you could be a great mix engineer if you got better. And nobody wants to hear that, but it's kind of the truth. If you fix the first one, the second one gets easier. It doesn't work the other way around.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, well, if you find that you're having to spend all this time on mixing, maybe you should spend more time on recording. But at the same time, if you're like, well, it took me 10 days to record this one part, because I just kept doing it over and over again. It's like, okay, maybe you need to just pick one.
Yeah. There's definitely a balance. And I think we all know, like, did I do my best work here? Not perfect, but did I give it the attention it needs? And if the answer is yes, then yeah, keep moving on. Because everything I've released, every time I release something, I put out a video or an article saying, here are the things I would do differently. Here are the places where I dropped the ball, because that's just going to happen. But I also see a progression where I don't make the same mistake twice. Well, I do, but I tend to not make those mistakes, like the recording the guitars too boomy. Haven't done that since because it was such a nightmare to try to fix. So it's also just a part of the journey of make this mistake, like you said before, have this failure, learn from it, and you progressively get better the more stuff you do and the more you release stuff.
Absolutely. So from a sonic standpoint, could you describe what in your mind is the difference when you're listening to a completed mix, between guitars that are mixed well versus guitars that are, just like it's amateur, it's just sounding grating, harsh, whatever you want to call it. What separates them? What about a poorly mixed guitar track would stand out to you versus one that you're like, this is good?
Two things stand out to me, and I do a fair amount of mix critiques for people, so I hear kind of both ends of the spectrum. The first is, especially with electric, but some with acoustic, people just kind of get nuts about cranking up the highs and making them super bright. And it could be if they're using like amp software, there's this tendency to just, well, it goes all the way up, so I guess I should turn it all the way up. and to balance that, not all the time, but sometimes they're older people. So when you're older, if you're in your 50s or 60s and you can't hear the high frequencies as well. So there's that little bit of they're boosting them just so they can hear them better. And then you have to say, hey, I know I get what you're doing, but you've made it too bright overall. It's sounding harsh. That's one thing. And then the other thing is just muddiness in the low end. It feels like it's either one or the other. They're either way bright or they're just way muffled and muddy and don't have much top end. And both hurt my ears, And the muddy one is, especially on acoustic guitar, that can happen pretty easily. And it can certainly happen on electric. But with electric, it seems like people have it too bright, and then they also crank up the gain way more than the song calls for.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that's probably like I'm a guitar player, but I'm not a ripping lead solo guitar guy. So I'm going to use some effects and overdrive to hide the fact that I'm not going to break into anything amazing. But there's an element of that. But you've got to also serve the song. If it's a really, I've heard songs that have this nice, almost kind of country ballad thing going, and then you hear this like Van Halen tone come in, and it's just these two do not go together.
Right.
Even though maybe by itself that's cool in certain contexts, but it doesn't fit. So just ease up on all that overdrive.
For sure. So now you touched on this a little bit before when we were talking about, maybe don't compress acoustic guitars so much. Mm-hmm. But, compression is one of those things that seems to just trip people up for a lot of instruments, a lot of things. And I think guitars are no different. So what advice or technique, what have you, would you have for getting great results from compressing guitars, if you did throw a compressor on it?
Yeah. So I learned this I've got a buddy, his name's Kevin Ward. He used to live here in the Nashville area. He's been mixing for decades. Like he's been in the business forever. And he showed me this, and I started trying it, and it's really fun. So I've started calling it butter compression. I don't know why. It just feels smooth to me, and I'm from
butter
the South.
Compression. I like it.
We like butter a lot here in the South, so I guess
right on.
Yeah, I don't know. So it's fairly simple. The idea is most of the time when you talk about compression, you're bringing the threshold down until some of the signal's crossing it, right? Mm-hmm. You get some gain reduction happening, and you're adjusting the attack and release to taste, right? That's the pretty typical way we do it. This one's kind of the opposite. It's almost as if, so the idea is turn the threshold all the way down and turn the ratio all the way down. So it's a 1-to-1, there's no compression, but the threshold's all the way down. And then set the attack and release to something middle of the road, like 50 milliseconds or something. And then while you've got that, start turning up the ratio just a little bit. So literally like 1.2 to 1, 1.3 to 1. And somewhere like by the time you get to 1.5, you'll see there's a good amount of compression happening, but it doesn't sound like the other kind of compression where you're just getting the peaks. Essentially, the entire signal is crossing the threshold, so the entire signal's being compressed a little bit. You don't hear the compression kicking on and off as much. It just has this kind of tightening smoothness to it that works really well, especially on like strummed, kind of bright strumming acoustic guitars. And I use it on just my electric guitar bus sometimes too, just to squish everything together a little bit more. It really, really is a smooth thing. It works great on vocals too. It's not the right thing all the time, but if everything's sounding good and you're just thinking, man, it could all just benefit from a little bit of compression, that's what I reach for, and it works well a lot of the time.
Wow, I love that. That's awesome. I got to try that myself. All right, so actually that's where I'm going to end today's show. Joe had so much incredible advice that I wanted to split this into 2 episodes. So tune in next week for part 2 of my interview with Joe Gilder. As a reminder, if you'd like to learn more from Joe, you can visit his site, homestudiocorner.com, or his YouTube channel. Thank you so much for listening today. And as a reminder, for links and information about today's show and our guest, please check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.